Indeed, my pleasure and honor to introduce our two speakers today, because they are longtime friends and colleagues of mine, longtime activists within the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti community, and very active within the school systems, both Lincoln and Ann Arbor. So both of them started out early in the education community world, but have now moved into genealogy, and particularly the genealogy and history of the Black Americans in our community. And certainly, from my perspective, have start to help us realize what it is, because as the title is, it's been hidden in the shadow of the water tower, and we know so little about the history of the Black American population within our area. And I think they will share some of the, and I know Henry can in part of it, the role that First Presbyterian Church has played in that history also throughout the time. So, indeed, it's my pleasure to introduce Cheryl Garnett and Omer G. Winborg as our speakers today.
I'm going to speak first because my friend here does not like to brag or talk. So I'm going to do the bragging for her and me. Okay, I was born in Ann Arbor, and my parents were William and Minnie Dixon, 620 Norfolk Ave. I'm the sister to Catherine Baker, who was a longtime member of this church, and the babysitter for Mr. Henry Johnson. Dear and loving friend Cheryl. And after a friendship for over 40 years, us doing genealogy together, we found out that we were cousins. So our history matched. So we have just taken off, speaking, and everywhere we go, we collect a relative. Everywhere. So we're going to start off. Cheryl's going to start off. You want to say something, Cheryl?
I just want to thank you for inviting us to be here. It's exciting for us always to present a little bit of our history as we share with you the history of Ypsilanti. Like Jean said, we were friends for a long time. I've been doing my genealogy since 1996. But when I was 16, my grandmother gave me our family tree from Buxton up in Canada. And it ended with her generation. It started with it would have been her third great-grandfather. Who would have been my fifth great-grandfather, fifth or sixth great-grandfather for me. And she wanted me to finish it when I was 16, and you know what a 16-year-old would do. Put it in one of my drawers. And then when my grandmother passed, I remember my promise. So I scurried up to Buxton, got the tree, and have started finishing it like I promised her. I'm excited that Diane asked us to share Ypsilanti's history with you guys. I moved to Ypsilanti about 40 years ago, moved to this area 40 years ago, moved to Ypsilanti about 10 years ago. But I never put the pieces together until I really started doing my genealogy. My mother was born in Ypsilanti. My great-great-grandmother was here in 1920 with my great-grandmother. And it sort of amazed me that I had moved to Ypsilanti. I never put the pieces together. What if I do? Oh, okay. What we say is our ancestors are looking for us to tell their story and are looking to us to share our story so that the world knows who we are, that they were here, and for us to be able to pass on to our children that we were here. So it's exciting for us to talk about Ypsilanti. We've never done a presentation on Ypsilanti before. But like I said, I'm back to where my mother was born and raised, and excited to share with you some of the history of Ypsilanti. And please, if you have questions, you can raise your hand, interrupt us. I know we're running to our time, on time, but a little late for your time.
Please, do not hesitate to interrupt us and ask us questions. That's how we learn and find out.
I am going to tell you that we are live streaming this, so when you ask your question, please ask it as clearly as you can, and then Cheryl or Jane might repeat it.
Please repeat it.
Yeah, I need to move. Yeah, I need to swipe these things. It's not my computer.
It's a little different. Let's try using
Okay. All right, page up. Now I need to go page up to go forward. There you go. All right. So what I'd like to share with you is it's the title of our presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. That our history is, I say, hidden in the shadow of the water tower, because so much of the history, early history and recent history for African Americans in Ypsilanti is they live on the south side. They kind of spread out around the community, but today and really since the early 1800s have actually congregated and gathered on the south side of Ypsilanti. Our learning objectives for today is just, like we said, to share with you the history of African Americans in Ypsilanti and Washtenaw County. It's a tale of free blacks, self-emancipators, Underground Railroad, freedom seekers, Revolutionary War, and Civil War veterans. Their stories are often, like I said, overlooked, and therefore many are absent from the history books and the history of Ypsilanti and Washtenaw County. It is the purpose of this presentation to supplement this history by sharing their story. And it's our hope, therefore, that at the end of this presentation, you'll have a greater appreciation for their lives and their contribution to Washtenaw County and, of course, the city of Ypsilanti.
I'm going to improve this evening. We're deafening everybody in the room.
That's good. That's good.
Okay. Let's get this out of the way. Beautiful face. That's going to be so much better.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I started sort of my research looking at the early history of Ypsilanti. It's like I won't just jump in. I'm a kind of history buff, and it's like I want to put us in context. So let's share with them a little bit just about the history and the creation of Ypsilanti. Well, in 1833, in the Treaty of Chicago, there was an agreement between the U.S. government and the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes. And that agreement was that they would cede their 5 million acres of land in Illinois, Wisconsin territories, and the Michigan territories to the United States government, and that they would move across the Mississippi River. Well, they did that. The Potawatomis did that, but they actually came back. And that area that's purple is the area where they were moved to. But today there are still Potawatomi tribal members living in the Ypsilanti area because the tribes actually came back. They were there for a while, but actually came back to their community. Now, the history of Ypsilanti, Michigan is that Ypsilanti was founded on the site of the former Potawatomi village in 1823, during the time of the Greek struggle for independence. And it was incorporated as a village in 1832, and then again as a city in 1858. The Chief Justice Augustus Woodward of Michigan named the city of Ypsilanti after Demetrius Ypsilantis. He was a Greek war hero. The story is that he was in the battle he had 30 men against 3,000 men. And during the night, he snuck his men away and under the fog of night and didn't lose a soldier. And so he became a warrior. And Woodward, thinking that his bravery and his ability to be such a hero represented to him the U.S. and their struggle for their independence and their struggle against a greater power. And so he named the city of Ypsilanti because of the territory that just opened up. And he was the Chief Justice of the territory. He decided to name the territory Ypsilanti. There's a bust of Ypsilantis in front of the water tower. I don't know, I've driven past that water tower a million times and really never noticed the bust. But there's actually there between the Greek and the U.S. flag. So next time you drive by, take a quick peek because that traffic goes. You start getting your head Washtenaw and then Washtenaw and it kind of intersects there with Cross Street. But that's where the tower is. Michigan Territory and the Ypsilanti homesteaders. Well, with the completion of the Erie Canal, it opened up the Michigan territories, and it triggered an influx of families from that area into Washtenaw County, and mainly from upstate New York and the New England states. And the homesteaders were enticed by the prospect of this rich farmland and all of the natural resources that we have here in Michigan. And they came, though, and what they created was a thriving community here in Washtenaw County, especially in the Ypsilanti area. They came before, had the rich soil, the timber. There were still some early trading, so that it was, and when the Erie Canal opened up and our waterways, they were able to actually get their produce to market, so it could be shipped east. And because we're so close to, I'm talking to Michiganders, our waterways. They could get their products all around the state at least. I'm sorry. You guys know Michigan. Well, the early African American settlers also were drawn to this area for a lot of the same reasons. And when they came, they did not necessarily find a hostile environment. These New Yorkers and the New Englanders were people who had relationships with free African Americans in their former homes. I do a presentation on the Revolutionary War. So a little piece of actually New France in the Revolutionary War. So I'll just talk to you. Prior to the Revolutionary War, Canada was known as New France because it belonged to France. Our history does not necessarily open us up to or share with us the fact that there was slavery actually in New France prior to it becoming Canada. In fact, there was slavery in New France for over 200 years. And it was as brutal as slavery was here in the United States, sometimes even more. And African Americans, like the ones who prior to the Civil War, went to Canada for freedom, those persons who were enslaved in New France ran to the United States because New York and the New England states didn't have slavery, and the people and they ran to freedom. In fact, in Rhode Island, the majority of the people who actually joined to fight in the Revolutionary War were people who had left New France as enslaved, but had actually ran to Rhode Island. And when you talk to, well, I won't make any assumptions because some of you look like my 5th grade grandmother, my 3rd grade grandmother. I won't say when I talk to African American families. But when I talk to the families, when we do our genealogy, the questions always asked, well, how is my great-grandparent up in Rhode Island so long ago? You know, in the 1700s. That doesn't make sense. They were people who ran from New France. And that's why they're there. That's why they're in Massachusetts. That's why they're in Rhode Island, why they're in Connecticut. And when they're looking to do their genealogy, they can't find them because the assumption is made that they should be in the South.
I thank her for that because that's what she taught me, and that's how I found my family.
Okay, back to this. But I just wanted to give you that piece of history as to why Ypsilanti wasn't a hostile community, and there wasn't these negative feelings because of the interactions and the relationships that the New Englanders and the people from upstate New York had with free blacks. They worked in their homes, they were barbers, they had their own businesses, they were blacksmiths, so that interaction was just natural. And so when African Americans moved to Ypsilanti, they were in a community that that was welcoming, and not necessarily welcoming, was not hostile. There were prominent abolitionists living in Ypsilanti at the time. Norris, Chase, Prescott, Copeland, Bennett, Griffin, and McAndrews might be names you might know or folks might be related to. Okay,
This is
hi.
must be me. Do you have any book titles that can give us more information on slavery in Canada?
Yes, I don't think we have them as a resource here, but yes, I do.
Maybe you can send them to me and I'll send them out to people over here.
Yeah,
Yes,
repeat
yes.
the question, please.
Okay, go ahead.
She wanted to know if I had books about slavery in Canada, and I do. Mhm. In addition to upstate New York, I talked about upstate New York. I already said that because I talked about the Revolutionary War and the fact that the free blacks had relationships with people, the early settlers. Well, in 1840, there were 58 blacks counted in Ypsilanti. They were either laborers, servants, or servants in the homes of white families. There were a few early farmers. I will talk about them. And in 1850, there were about 70 blacks living in Ypsilanti. The Fugitive Slave Act came in 1850, and that pushed many free blacks in to head this way, seeking their freedom, because they would pass through Ypsilanti on to Detroit, and from Detroit cross over to Canada. Okay? And there was a railroad, it was Michigan, because the name has changed several times, Michigan Central, that went from Ypsilanti to Detroit, and could get people right to the shores of the Detroit River, and people would cross there. Some of those people actually stayed in Ypsilanti, and the population in 1860 was around 220. But there were they said there was over 10,000 people actually had left the United States during the 1850s to get to Canada. My family, one branch of my family actually left the United States and was actually in Canada in 1850. I had another branch, my grandmother's branch. William Darrow was in Canada in 1831. He married in 1838. In 1860, the years during the Civil War and the decades that followed, Ypsilanti was seen by many as tolerant, if not welcoming, for blacks. However, black Ypsilantians lived in segregated families clustered in several parts of the town that included Eminent Valley, that's kind of off of Washington, the Depot Town, and near Oakwood and Washington. And that's sort of we're looking at the south side of Ypsilanti, kind of where folks are now. Okay, so then this was started up until 1860. Blacks were kind of marginalized then, but the town was not completely segregated. And I don't, if you know kind of American history, I'm working with my grandson on American history. I assume you guys know. But during the Civil War, there were actually debates in Michigan as to whether or not the reasons for the war were valid. Okay, so that the attitudes of the community didn't necessarily change, but there was some tensions around the Civil War, and especially tensions with this influx of African Americans. Because the numbers were smaller, but all of a sudden the numbers just grew. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. And that might ring bells with what's going on now in this country. How people respond when there's an influx of people who are different than them. It's one thing when we're in the majority, and all of a sudden it's like, are we going to wind up being the minority, or what's happening? And so there were blacks who began to be marginalized in terms of their relationships with the white citizens of Ypsilanti. Black-owned businesses, grocery stores, barbershops, and construction companies that had many white patrons started to lose their patronage. People started to kind of cling to themselves. They didn't know what was happening, and they, out of fear or concern, started to not necessarily patronize those African American businesses. And in this period, there were many who returned to the United States from the settlements in Canada. So that's why it was like people are coming north, and people are coming from blacks are coming from the north, and they're coming from the south. And because the folks who came to Ypsilanti initially found it welcoming, their family members followed them. And because people who were in Canada after the Civil War, Ypsilanti had been welcoming, they came back to this community. Okay? But these are the individuals and the families who supported the freedom seekers as they came to this community. I don't know if these names are familiar with you, but there's Henry R. Griffin. He was a Quaker principal at the Academy of Teachers. Allen A. Copeland, he was a prominent member of the Presbyterians of Ypsilanti. Justin Norris, I said he was a Methodist businessman. W.W. Patchen, he was a former teacher in Raisin Institute. Raisin Institute was the institute school that was started by Laura Haddiston out in Tecumseh. Adrian. That's accurate. Adrian. She was an abolitionist, and her Raisin School was the first integrated school in the state of Michigan. I shared the Chase family, the Urotas Morton family, George McCoy family, Brown Chapel, the Second Baptist Church, and Prince Bennett family here in Ypsilanti. Those were individuals, communities, and businessmen that actually helped the freedom seekers. I always ask the question, well, how did they get here? Well, these are the kind of ways. The Potawatomis, like I said, were the first Native Americans of Ypsilanti. They were the freedom seekers that used their trails. They actually used the Native American trails to come up to Michigan. They came by trains, like you said, Michigan Central. The Ypsilanti community, Quaker community, the white religious community helped African Americans get here. And then again, we talked about us being surrounded by water, and that the waterway and the railroad being a way of entering into Michigan and then moving on to Canada. The highway, or Interstate 94, It actually follows the Native American trails. And the train tracks. They all follow the Native American trails here. Jean shares in her in her presentations about the in your Underground Railroad presentation, that every 10 miles there is either a AME church or a Second Baptist church, because people could walk 10 miles a day. And so,
The trail we do, we kind of do it together. So see those places I can't see up close, where everywhere there's a marker. In the 1830s, Chain Link Baptist Church started, and it went all the way up. But every one of those stops is an AME or a Baptist church. African American Episcopal Church. And most of them are, like in Ann Arbor, there was Bethel AME on 4th Ave, 2 doors from where I used to live, and right around the corner was Second Baptist. And in Ypsilanti, there was the Second Baptist, and then around the corner was Brown Chapel. And that's all the way through those stops. So they could walk at night, 10 miles, rest, and they were assured that they were in a safe place because it was a church.
so to talk about Jim Crow and Ypsilanti. After the Civil War in the 1870s, the African American community of Ypsilanti was not immune from the white supremacist reactions to black liberties won in the Civil War and Reconstruction. So by 1880, the African American population had risen to 440, which was about 10% of the city's population. And with this increase in their numbers, there was also an increase in, like I said, the hostility towards them in the 1880s and 1890s. Eventually, the work that, like I said, blacks performed for whites as barbers, domestics, laundries, was no longer available to them. So eventually, with blacks being shut out of the institutions and public discourse, as well as the downtown stores, the theaters, the restaurants, it became a situation that lasted for decades. In response to these negative attitudes and the actions, the African Americans then built their own benevolent organizations, fraternal and benevolent organizations, their religious institutions, their own political groups, like the Afro-American Protective League of the 1890s. They built their own, within their own community. They had their, like I said, their own stores, their own barbers, their own grocers. But most blacks voted for the Republican Party, except for one. It was said that only one black Democrat, there was only one black Democrat in the city. He was a local dog catcher. Now, his name was John Harry, family member. There's some things you shouldn't share. It's like, well, you know, I could pick somebody else's family, but why would I pick on them when I talk about mine? Okay? But Ypsilanti was actually Michigan's most diverse city in the 1900s. There were over 600 blacks living in Ypsilanti, and that was about 10% of the population. Compared to the 1900 census, the black population in Michigan was only 7%. In Detroit, it was only 1.4%. And in Ann Arbor, it was only 3%. Ypsilanti, during the 1900s, was the most integrated city in Michigan. It's like, ta-da! Who knew that? 10% of the population compared to 7% in the state. and 1.4% in Detroit. You think of, it's like, there are more African Americans living in Ypsilanti than in Detroit. This increase in population resulted in African American families from the South migrating to Michigan to seek work and greater freedom in the 1900s. They were drawn to Ypsilanti to work for its budding industries that included the Ford Motor Plant in Willow Run that, at the time of World War II was converted to the Willow Run bomber plant. There was a U.S. Press steel factory here. There was the Ypsilanti Water Company. And there were local black businesses that included Isaac Hardy's grocery store. This was in the middle of the African American community. There was Anna McCoy's hairdressing salon. And there was Hezekiah Norris's barber shop. So they had their own stores, their own entrepreneurs working, which drew other people to Ypsilanti to take advantage of the fact that this was a community that's 10% black. More blacks lived here, so as a black entrepreneur, you had the opportunity to have a business, and a business that you could live and survive because you had patrons, as well as then the industry that was in the area that drew folks from the South. Ford Motor Company was paying $5 an hour. $5 a day. Nobody got that money anywhere. Now there's a genealogical problem, and it says it solves it. There were so many folks here from Canada. In fact, on Adams Street, which is at the time, one of the major roads in the community, there were 22 families living on Adams Street. 20 of them were from Canada, had Canadian roots. Well, this is an article that showed up in, is the name of the paper here? Yeah, the Ypsi Press, 1901. Students, I'm not going to read it all. Students from Eastern were helping to take the census. And they're finding that all of these folks were born in America. Well, there's this scare going around that said Queen Victoria had died, and there was a session of King Edward, and the joke that was played on some of the African Americans were that that there was going to be an edict that the colored people needed to return to Canada. It says and the article says colored people are in mortal terror for fear that the new king would require all his subjects to return to their realm. Well, that meant they have to leave their homes, they have to leave their businesses. It was like, that wasn't true. But there were so many people there that they started changing their place of birth. My great grandfather, who was born in Canada, it says right on his draft document that his mother brought him to the U.S. in 1899 when he was 1.5 years old. But if you look at the records, he's born in America. He's a U.S. citizen. He also says he votes often. He wasn't a U.S. citizen. But that was my family history. Other people looking for their families can't find them because they say they're born in that. No, they were born in Canada. You're looking for their records here in the United States and you can't find them. You never think to look at the census data in Canada and find them right there. I'm going to talk a little bit about urban renewal and the impact on the African American community. Before the urban renewal of 1950 and 60s, Ypsilanti was a cohesive community made richer by the diversity and experiences of its residents. There were folks from the South, there were folks who had come from Canada, there were folks that were here early, and their families had this rich history. But after the construction of U.S. Interstate 94, the community was devastated. The freeway cut right through the middle of the African American community. And in fact, my second great grandmother's house left with was one of the houses that was demolished. It's right there as you go on the entry ramp to Ann Arbor. If you're going down Hamilton, getting on 94. The African Americans in political actions, the African American community protested the construction of the interstate because they feared the consequences. And as they feared, it destroyed the African American business community, took out, like I said, older homes, and the roots of its early African American families. And it really resulted in a disconnection between the early families and their descendants, because they didn't know where their family members were. They didn't even know that they might not have known that they were actually in Ypsilanti, where they lived, or what their history was. And they lost with that knowledge was actually the knowledge of their accomplishments and their contributions to Ypsilanti and Washington County. Talk about the education of African American children in Ypsilanti. This is something for you guys. The old Presbyterian church located on Pearson Street, is where the Owens Business College stands right now. It was sold in 1857 for $1,200 to the city to be used as the school for colored children. And this is a picture of it. It was erected in 1836. This building is the Ypsilanti's segregated Adams Street School in the 1900s. H.P. Jacobs, who was one of the founders of Second Baptist Church of Ypsilanti, also founded the original African American school in Ypsilanti. But H.P. Jacobs also started the Second Baptist Church in Ypsilanti, actually in the old Presbyterian church. So the old Presbyterian church allowed them to start the Second Baptist church there. And the members met there until they could build their own church. But in addition, they had the school there. And H.P. Jacobs helped to found that school. Originally, though, the black children in Ypsilanti could go to the Ypsilanti public schools, but they were required to sit in the back. So tired of this humiliation, it led Jacobs to then move the families, the black families in Ypsilanti, to remove their children from that school. So they removed the children from what was the integrated school and built then a school for them. And that's the Adams Street School. This is a picture of it now. That picture I just showed you before was a picture of the school. It was built during the Civil War in 1864, and it was specifically to educate Ypsilanti's black children. The first teacher would be an African American barrel maker named John Hall. The school was also the host to Michigan's first black school principal, and generations of school children were taught there, mostly by black teachers.
The building is still there. That's a picture that I took in 2013, and if you go by, it's still there. It's New Jerusalem Church.
It's right next to the AMU church there.
The Brown Chapel. Brown Chapel. And in between the funeral home.
But this is a picture of the classes, two classes of Adams Street School children. I can't see if that's your left or your right. The older picture, okay, I can't see which is your right or your left.
This is, okay, the one furthest the left, that's your left.
Your left, okay. That's the Adams Street School class of 1907. And their teacher was Anna Chambers Alexander. She was a white woman. She was one of the first, maybe first among the white women who were teachers there. She was beloved by the children. She was the kind of person who went and collected clothing for the children. She took care of them. She was someone, when she died, that the community actually turned out because of her relationship with the children there. Her husband was killed in a, her husband died, and she was actually killed in a automobile accident. But she was very much beloved by the community because of the way she cared for the children. This picture on the right is the Adams Street School of 1915. And this is a picture my grandmother gave me. I'll show you the old picture. This is a clip of it. So I can show you who my grandmother is in this class. My grandmother said she started school at the age of 4. Teacher in this class is Bernice Kersey. She was one of the African American teachers. She was the first and second grade class. So this is the first and second grade class. And then let me show you who my family members. You see that? This is my grandmother's handwriting, which is why I showed you this slide. My grandmother is the little one sitting on the bottom row there. Behind her is her first cousin. All the little arrows are pointing to her cousins that were in her class. And the woman standing on the end is Miss Kersey. That's my grandmother's first grade in this. She went to school with all her cousins. And a lot of these families are still in Ypsilanti. There's the Kerseys, there's the Scotts, there's the Pools, the Richardsons, the Davises, the Wrights. Those are all I can read. This is kind of off the page. But all of these families, a lot of, I think Brown, a lot of these families are still here in Ypsilanti, including me. There was no joke that realized I'm here too. The religious and social life, extreme strength.
So I thought that all my history was that my parents were sharecroppers in the South, and that they were Africans, and they were dropped as enslaved people in Virginia, and then they made it to Tennessee, and then they came to Ann Arbor. That's not all my history. My history includes, and Cheryl's wonderful knowledge of history and Black loyalists, and I have to ask her, Cheryl, am I related to these people? Are these our family? And so, yes, and so this has just been wonderful learning my history and who I am. Is this backwards or? Okay. All right, Frederick Douglass was a frequent visitor in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. He encouraged the men in the Ypsilanti to fight in the Civil War. He wrote an article in the Liberator, and I'm going to talk about that because your church was involved in that. Also in Ypsilanti was the State Convention of Colored Men of Michigan was held in Ypsilanti, and they appointed a committee to appear before the legislature, and they urged the removal of the word white. That meant that blacks were ignored, and they were not included in the state constitution. So this was in Ypsilanti in 1863. They often had Emancipation Day. And Emancipation Day was a celebration of slavery in Canada, in which it ended in 1834. This was a Canadian celebration. However, the event was celebrated in Ypsi, Ann Arbor, and other black communities throughout Michigan. They would trade in different places, Battle Creek, all those places that you saw on that map. They would go back and forth and have Emancipation Day. Not Emancipation 1865, but Emancipation 1834, Canadian.
That's because of the Canadian, that's because of so many of them were from Canada.
Yeah. I'll get this. The NAACP was started in 1918 in Ypsilanti, and Dr. Lawrence Perry was a member of the Ypsilanti NAACP. And the Willow Run branch of the National Association of Advancement of Colored People officially and informally received its charter from Dr. L.C. Perry, a member of the Ypsilanti branch of the NAACP. So they started that in 1918. This is familiar to you or anybody in this church, it should be. It's the founding meeting of the Michigan Anti-Slavery Society was held in the First Presbyterian Church located on this site on November the 10th, 1836. Delegates from 6 counties elected officers and adopted 14 resolutions denouncing slavery. This convention led to the establishment in Jackson in 1839 of the American Freeman, the state's first anti-slavery newspaper, and its successor was the Ann Arbor Signal of Liberty in 1841. That building there, it used to be the Ann Arbor News. Started in Ann Arbor. This association anti-slavery by this church was 75 abolitionists, and I'm going around collecting all these abolitionists because there was one that I was really surprised on, and his name was Eber White. And you know, Eber White School, he was an abolitionist, and he was his property. So Cheryl and I do research with property and where people were, and his property was at the end of, guess what? Liberty Street. Duh! His goal was to abolish slavery in the 1830s. Members adopted 14 anti-slavery resolutions. That's in Ann Arbor, this church, 1830s. The First Presbyterian Church was erected in 1836 and was used by the congregation of Second Baptist Church led by H.P. Jacobs. They have a celebration every year where the two churches meet together. And when I first went there to do a little research and talk to someone, it was a new pastor and he didn't understand why they met together. Well, they met together because that's where the church started. Okay, this is Second Baptist Church in 1865. And when my parents came here from the South, they went to Second Baptist first, and I thought that was unusual until I started doing my history. Their pastor was in Brownsville, Tennessee, where they came from, and he came to Second Baptist. All these people talked to each other. My dad and mom came to places where their family were, and I didn't know that. Ypsilanti's early African-American churches. This is Brown Chapel. It was built in 1856, one of the oldest African-American AME churches in Michigan. It started in the home of the founders Flora Thomas and Silas Jones. And in 1856, Jesse and Ida Stewart donated 2 lots on the corner of Buffalo and Adams Street to the congregation. The oldest building is still there and is currently in use today. Below is a copy of the stained glass window in the church. The new church building is located at 1043 West Michigan Avenue, and Olive Lucinda Carroll, Cheryl's grandmother, was a deaconess in the 1920s. This is the Palm Leaf Club. This is an African-American social club, and it began in 1904 with the Trustees Helpers of Brown Chapel in Ypsilanti. It's affiliated with the Women's Club of Michigan State. It's Association of Colored Women's Club. African-American women in Ypsi formed their own organization as a white literary society of women were debating whether or not they would allow them or accept black women in their organization. So they started their own. And the Palm Leaf Club is still in existence today. This is the 5th Jubilee Singers. Maybe some of you have heard that sing. And they came to Ypsilanti in May 28th. What year was that, Cheryl? Do you remember? I can't see. 1887. Oh, yeah. Okay. This is the Good Samaritan Hall. The original Good Samaritan Hall was built in 1893 by the Order of the Good Samaritans and Daughters of the Samaritan. It is still there. It's replaced an earlier building meeting house at the same location that was destroyed by a tornado that destroyed downtown Ypsilanti in 1893. Now, there's a whole story behind that. We're just skimming over things. This is St. Andrew's Lodge, number 7, 1895 to 1945. Same building. Yeah. It's still there. You can go by and see that. Okay. This is an article I was telling Cheryl. I want her to comment because we were debating us. Okay, the local Ypsilanti press ignored rich social and religious lives of African American community. These crude references to the African American community in the local newspapers were often only found in crime sections. This led to the establishment of independent black newspapers like Detroit's Plain Dealer, The Informant, and the Detroit Tribune, who had weekly columns that recorded the religious, social, political life of the community. If you really want to do research on your family, you should look to these newspapers because they covered the whole areas, not just one specific area like Detroit, but it would be Detroit, Chicago, and everywhere. And Cheryl, I said, please put something positive in here about the Perrys, don't. So this one was an article.
Great grandfather.
Okay. You want to say some more? No. Say some more. You can read the article.
He was 17. That's what I said. He was young.
Is that Perry's school named after?
It's a relative, but not.
Oh, okay.
It was named after Dr. Lawrence Perry, who was the gentleman who was a member of the NAACP.
Okay.
He was a dentist in Ypsilanti.
Is that the same Perry family of contractors?
Yeah.
They're relatives of ours. Yeah. So you're beginning to see connections between people when you speak out and talk to us, and that's why we do. Because we were doing something. I was doing something on the internet. I was doing the Underground Railroad presentation for people in Denver, and ran into a cousin. I didn't know it was a cousin. Contact. I told Cheryl who it was. She knew immediately where she was and where she fit, and we've been talking and in love ever since. So this was some of the early occupations in the city directory of the African Americans that were in the Ypsilanti community.
And the numbers.
Yeah, and the numbers. 2 barbers, butcher, carpenter, 5, cooks, 6, masons, 8. See how many masons there were? Teamsters mean they horse wagon. That's what the teamster means. Yeah. This information is in H.P. Jacobs' book, and it was reprinted in 2011. The library had only 1 copy, and I've had it, and it's overdue. They're going to come. A.P. Marshall. Yeah, they're going to come send the police. They're going to send the police after me because I had the book. I can't find a copy of it. There's no more. It's out of print.
A.P. wrote the book?
Huh? A.P. Marshall wrote the book. Yeah. Yeah. He wrote the book, a wonderful book about Ypsilanti history. This is the information came from
He
him.
was a champion for it.
Yes, he was. Absolutely. Yeah, that's why I said I'm going to get arrested. I had the book. If you look at it, I had the book. I'm going to get arrested. I'm going to take it back to the library. And it's embarrassing because I'm a trustee. So I want to talk a little bit about the families. And oh my goodness, what can I say? Here's some of the families: the Richardsons, the Days and the Rays, H.P. Jacobs, the Kerseys, the Andersons, the Artists, the Harrises. This is just some of them.
Jean, you have the Richardson who was the mayor until
By marriage.
They're by marriage, she's related to us. So the Rays came to Washtenaw County in the 1700s from New Jersey and Pittsfield Township. They were very active in the Underground Railroad movement. They worked with William Lambert, if you don't know who that is, George W. Batiste, and William Webb. I love those men. They were from Detroit. He worked with them. He was in the Color Convention. Also was Day as a surname. was my neighbor. She lived across the street from me, and they were related to the Baker family, who lived in the same neighborhood. My sister married into that family. So Asher Ray was one, if you just Google his name, he was a wonderful Underground Railroad person. Was here in the early 1800s. His family was 1700s. Zorbella Simmons and George Richardson. George was born in Nova Scotia, Canada in 1860 and came to Washtenaw County in 1890. He lived in Whitaker and Ypsilanti. George Richardson could not read or write. He owned 150 acres of land, and at the time he was one of the richest African American landowners in Michigan. He was the father of 19 children. And he's listed in the book of Negroes in Michigan History by John W. Green. Both Cheryl and I have DNA matches with the Richardsons.
Did you get any of that money?
H.B. Jacobs, very interesting. I'm just skimming over his history. He stole his master's wagon and came north to Ypsilanti in 3 weeks with a wife and children. And I couldn't figure out how he did it. Because he came on a path on the Underground Railroad and he knew exactly where he was going. He was taught to read and write by his slave owners, family member. One of the founders of Second Baptist Church in Ypsilanti, the founder of the African American School on South Adams Street. He left Ypsilanti, returned to the South, went back to school, became a doctor. He's also the founder of, Jackson State? Jackson State University. Has a wonderful history. Yeah, I'm just telling a little bit of his story. There's a whole much to it. Okay, the Kerseys lived in Indiana. They moved to Canada. They moved to Ypsilanti and settled there. They were carpenters by trade. They built Brown Chapel and Peace Auditorium. They built several houses on First Avenue. And in fact, I'd go down and Cheryl said they built that one, that one, that one, that one. Yep, First Avenue. She said that's a project we should take on to find out because they were modeled after houses in Canada. And so she knew immediately from her history. They were very active in the Underground Railroad. Bernice Kersey taught at the Freedom School. Both Cheryl and I have DNA matches with the Kerseys. They're our relatives. There was John Anderson. He was enslaved in Missouri. He escaped from his enslaver in a hail of bullets. I remember reading an article and it said that his enslaver he knew he wasn't going to get hit. He kept running because he said he was worth $1,000. He arrived in Ypsi in 1860. He fought in the Civil War in the Michigan 102nd. He told his story to the local newspaper in 1902. He's buried in Highland Cemetery. There's the Artis. This is not a picture of them because I didn't have a picture. They're an early Ypsilanti family. And the Artis were a free black family from North Carolina. They moved to Indiana. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, they moved to Canada. But later married into the Kersey family and returned to Ypsilanti after the Civil War. Now, what interests me about the Artis family was that they were involved in black loyalists. I didn't even know what that was until Cheryl found out the history and found my ancestors in Canada. I had never heard, I didn't learn it in high school, I didn't learn it in college, what a black loyalist was. I know now, and those were my family members. Black loyalists. They fought with the British against the United States.
Before the United States, with the colonists,
There's a Kersey who coaches football or at a young man, probably in his 50s.
Probably
Probably a relative.
The Kerseys are still here.
They're still here. He's probably a relative.
They're still Kerseys.
So when we do something, we talk like this, we always find another relative. So we always find a relative. And I didn't know I was so connected. The Harrises were early family members, and they were born in Ontario, Canada. They were black loyalists. Also, they fought with the British and was given land in Canada. They came to Michigan in 1879, and they listed in the 1880 census are listed it as living in Augusta Township. In Augusta Township, I'm going to show you the connection between Augusta Township. Those of us who live here know and call it Sumter. In Michigan, there was a black population out there. And I'm going to tell you something amazing. Married to the Taylor Kersey family. Oh, we're related to them also. This is an amazing story, and I always make sure I'll tell it. This is William Perry. I made her tell this story, okay? And he was born 1859 to 1940 in Ontario, Canada. And I'm going to tell it, but then I'm going to have her add to it. This is a Ford Motor plant, the powerhouse staff. Perry is the seventh from the left in the photograph. There's an arrow pointing to him. And until his death, he worked at this plant until his death in 1940. In 1914, Henry Ford hired Ford Motor Company's first African-American employee, former bricklayer named William Perry. Perry had earned the now famous industrialist respect years earlier when the two worked together sawing trees for Ford's lumber business. Perry saved Ford's life by preventing a man from hitting Ford in the back with an axe. Perry's employment opened the door to employment of family and other African Americans at the time of his death in 1940. He was Cheryl's great uncle. Because of him, African Americans could work in the Ford plant.
We got lots of relative jobs there. So we have the history of Ford Motor Company. In fact, my grandfather and my grandmother worked with Ford, and both of them retired from Ford.
The Massachusetts 54th was the movie where Glory was made from, and they just put a monument honoring the black soldiers erected, designed by John Pappas, dedicated June 22nd at Highland Cemetery, Ypsilanti. Yeah. Cheryl? I'll read it and I want you to talk about it. Okay, John Gay was born in Virginia in 1830. He's listed in the 1860 census with his wife Mary and two children, Polly and John. He enlisted as a private on 14th of November 1863 in Company C and in the 1st Michigan Colored Infantry Regiment. He is called the Corps d'Afrique by the Detroit Free Press at the time. And then later it became the 102nd U.S. Colored Infantry. Gay died of a disease on the 11th of March 1865 in Beaufort, South Carolina, after the Battle of Fort Sumter. Buried in Beaufort National Cemetery in South Carolina. His widow was married to Elijah Ross of the 54th Massachusetts. All right, would you please tell a story? I want you to tell a story. Okay, I want her to tell this story. She just
Ross was also injured in the Battle for Sumter. And that's what the movie is, Glory is about. Ross was also injured there. And both he and Gay were hospitalized together. That's where he met Gay. And later came to Ypsilanti and married his widow.
This is her.
That's my great
Yes. And he was the first official African-American unit. It's so funny. We have funny stories to tell, too, all the time. We were researching him. We went all the way to Washington, D.C., looking for his pension papers. And we were up there at the table reading the pension papers, trying to find out where he was buried. He was buried in Highland Cemetery down the street from where I live. He's the first official African-American unit of the United States during the Civil War, composed completely of free men who volunteered to fight on the side of the Union in order to bring an end to slavery from which their families had escaped years before. Elijah Ross was a member of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment that fought in the Civil War and whose exploits are depicted in the movie Glory. And in 1880, Elijah Ross was living in Ypsilanti, Michigan with his wife Mary. Mary was a widow with children, 4, from another freedom fighter, which he just said, John Gay, who was a member of the Michigan 102nd, the colored troops. Ross died in Ypsilanti in 1899 and is buried in Highland Cemetery, located in Ypsilanti and plot with 7 other family members. This is Cheryl's great uncle.
And he was one of the men that was recruited by Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, he lived in the Chatham area of Buxton. And Frederick Douglass went up to Buxton and to recruit free black men to come back to the United States to fight on the side of freedom and to be able to free their family members. And he was one of the men that came back to the United States to fight. And he got to Michigan, and Michigan was slow at arming the men. So he went on to Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass's 2 sons were also in the Massachusetts 54. So I think Frederick Douglass probably told go on to, and they're putting together this unit in Massachusetts. So he left Michigan and went to Massachusetts and became part of the Massachusetts 54. The 55th and the 102nd all fought in the movie Glory, but they all fought there for Fort Sumter.
And the amazing thing about his, he still lived, was that it took him a long time to get his pension. African American men made less. And when I was reading, I was so devastated because of the way that the war was. They were fighting and it was like uphill and he was shooting down. He ended up with a wounded arm and a leg, yeah. And so it's a wonder he survived the way it was.
He didn't get his pension until the year before he died.
Yes. Resting in peace in the colored section. Generations of Ypsilanti and African Americans are buried in Ypsilanti, including 100 in unmarked graves on the cemetery northern edge. The traditional colored area of the Highland Cemetery, many Civil War veterans are also buried there. Other cemeteries where African Americans are buried include Arbor, Stony Creek, and Woodlawn. Let me tell you something that I just found out about the cemetery. I can't point the second one. So I'm a retired high school teacher, and I went to an open house. And I went to an open house out in Augusta Township. And they had it in a big hall. And so I had to go to the bathroom. And so I left out and looked in the hall, and I went, oh my goodness, this is a Quaker church. And so I came back and I asked my student family, and they said, yeah, it was a Quaker church. And Prince Bennett was, it was a church that Prince Bennett had once belonged to. And so he's buried in this cemetery. And so I was looking for George and his 19 children, and they're buried out there with him. So I know that he was part of the reason why George made it to Augusta Township. So, with that, we have just a little timeline. And our references. And we want to thank you very much for inviting us.
You know, it's getting late and later than we planned, just because we started late, not because they went over, just because we started late. Well,
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Exactly.
very interesting.
And being an African American, I can chronicle some of those same kinds of unconnectedness, and I find I have 2 families. That's a twin I was adopted when we were 2. And we found our family, biological family, in 1993.
Oh, wow.
And it's been, you're finding relatives.
Yes.
Where, Henry, where are your from this area?
My biological, no, Atlanta.
Oh,
And my adopted parents were from a small town north of Atlanta.
okay.
But just, and my twin sister found the biological family. She lived in Los Angeles. She was married to the urban league director, John Hancock. And quickly, she called me one night and said, I have some news. And I said, well, I'm going out the door. I'm going to a concert. And she said, I think you want to stay home. And why do you want to stay home? She said, well, all your brothers and sisters, of which there were 7, I'm going to start calling you all over the country. And they did. They children accepted that. So I never got to. But all of these kinds of revelations come up.
Yeah.
Mind-blowing.
Yes. I had to wait till I got 100 to find out.
Come on.
Well, I too want to thank Cheryl for what I know about some of the systemic racism. This is not just around Ypsilanti, but she and I chaired a committee for 8 years, and I got a whole chance to get a lot of information and wealth of knowledge from her, and also from my relationship with Jean. So I'm hoping you just got at least a small amount today and can start us to start thinking about our neighboring community, especially, and its relationship to the Black Americans. So thank you very much.